Good morning. My name is Barbara Steinberg. Welcome to live Q&A about Senate Bill 1572. I want to take a couple of minutes to provide a little bit of background, tell you about myself, and then open the floor up for the questions that are not answered on the Arizona Department of Education spreadsheet, or if you've received the PDF I created with some general information. I know that there are questions that were not answered in there. So again, my name is Barbara Steinberg, and I'm actually a former classroom teacher. I taught for 12 years in both public and private, urban and rural. And it was during my time as a classroom teacher teaching upper elementary that I really started to wonder what was going on for a large number of students who sat in my classroom and had difficulty with reading. And the story that I share with fellow educators is that I chose to teach upper elementary because I didn't really want to have to teach what's called the foundations of reading. I wanted to work with kids and talk about literature and talk about knowledge. I didn't want to have to teach how sounds and symbols connect, which is why I chose 4th and 5th grade. But then, of course, the joke was on me because I had lots of students who, even though they had the verbal abilities to talk about sophisticated text and make these incredible connections, they just couldn't decode. And I had no training, in spite of the fact I had been a teacher for more than a decade. I had my reading endorsement. I had a master's. I really didn't have an idea of what was happening inside of the brains of these students. And so I searched. I was frustrated. My students were frustrated, and I just couldn't find the answers until finally I found the answers. And it led me back to graduate school to study language-based reading disabilities. And I had every intention of going back into the classroom in some capacity to work with students who struggled because of an isolated weakness. And that isolated weakness, of course, is dyslexia. And I became just engrossed and passionate about finding out everything I could about dyslexia. And when I went back to the schools and districts, and this was back in 2010, and I said, I know why so many students are struggling. It's because of dyslexia. And school after school, district after district said, no, we don't talk about dyslexia. And I, being, even though a little bit older in my career at this point, but just as naive and, ambitious as if it was my first year, said, but we have the science to prove its existence. Of course, why aren't we talking about this? And I really came to a crossroads in my career and knew that until classroom educators could really understand what we now call the science of reading and really could ask the questions that need to be asked when we have a struggling student in front of us, which is, why is this student struggling? Is it a decoding issue? Is it a language comprehension issue? Because those are two very different issues, and we need to know how to assess them differently. We need to know how to intervene differently, because not all tier 2, tier 3 students have the same need. And as I, came to this crossroads and made this really difficult decision to leave the classroom, I started to offer workshops to teachers, because I knew that if my colleagues had the same knowledge that I now had, that we could do better, because when we know better, we do better. And after a couple of years of just offering workshops and doing what I do best, which is teach, but this time to teachers who could turn around and exponentially affect kids' lives way more than I could with just 25 kids or 30 kids in my class, word began to spread. Awareness began to grow. And in 2015, legislation was passed. And the legislation that was passed, this was my guiding question. How can I share this with my colleagues? Legislation was passed in Oregon in 2015. And Arizona's legislation is a copycat of what was passed in Oregon. And by the time it was passed, I had kind of become known in Oregon as like the dyslexia guru. I'm going to come back to this slide. And because of that, I was able to train 70% of Oregon. And 70% of Oregon received the same training that has now been replicated in Arizona. And it is hands down the most incredible thing I've done in my career thus far. And so when some Arizona educators heard that Arizona had passed legislation, they reached out to me and I said, okay, like I can do this again. And here we are. Congratulations. It's a wonderful piece of legislation. I know it's a tight timeline to be able to fulfill the requirements. The piece, of course, of the larger Senate bill that I'm referring to is the dyslexia training designee, which requires one educator in every K-3 to receive comprehensive training in understanding and recognizing dyslexia, foundational reading instruction that is good not just for those who have warning signs of later reading difficulty, but all students. Because the foundational skills needed to translate research into practice, to translate oral language into written form, are the same regardless. And lastly, how do we intensify instruction for the hardest to reach? How do we use the limited amount of time we have to make the greatest gains? And here we are. The year is kicked off for you already. You have until July 1st. And how are you going to accomplish it? So I know that there are multiple vendors to pick from. Regardless of who you pick, I think it's a giant step forward. And I just want to be able to answer any questions you have. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over. You can put a question in the chat. You can unmute and ask a question.
I'll ask a question.
Yay.
Hi. So the designee who receives this training per SB 1572, are they then going to be responsible for training the teachers at the school?
Great question. The legislation itself does not require the teacher training designee to be a trainer of trainers. But what I want to tell you is what happened in Oregon and how I would position this chosen person to be a conduit of knowledge and tools and strategies to their staff. So if you have a team and you send one K-3 teacher, and that K-3 teacher goes to this training, learns a huge body of knowledge, and comes back, and their peers, their colleagues at the same grade level or within a primary band have not had that same training, it's quite difficult to have change happen from one person. And of course, it would be insane to think that you have the capacity to send your entire K-3 staff. So even though it's not legally required for this person to come back and train his or her staff, I have this, it's called Learn Worlds. It's basically like a holding space where every single PowerPoint, resource, strategy, website, anything I share with the person who comes to training is stored for all time. And if that person goes to their admin and says, hey, can I do a 50-minute, 1-hour presentation on the science of reading? I've already created the PowerPoint that they can turn around and do that so that they don't have to recreate the wheel. Do they have to do it? Are they legally required to do it? No. And there was a lot of confusion around that in Oregon because the person coming felt like all of a sudden now they were responsible for doing something that was outside the scope of the legislation. But if that person's open to it, I will make sure they have everything they need to do it and do it well, because I'm only one person and I can't train everybody. And I want every K-3 teacher to get this training.
Is amazing. I'm so excited about Learn Worlds. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I have a question.
great.
Tom Fletcher from Yuma. So in this training, will we be given tools such as particular assessments we can use?
Yes, good question. So in the final module of intensification, it's 2 days. One full day is assessment and the next full day is intensification. The assessment module looks at assessment through 2 lenses. One is screening. And I use an analogy of screening. A student, this is one of the many statistics I share in training. A student who fails to read adequately in 1st grade has a 90% probability of reading poorly in 4th grade. We have the ability at the start of kindergarten, before kids are actually readers, to look ahead and to say, will this student hit the wall in reading development in the middle of 1st grade, in the middle of 2nd grade? That is the job of a screener. And I teach how to administer. The administration is, of course, easy, but even more important, what do we do once we've screened? How do we interpret that data? And how do we design interventions in kindergarten, preventative interventions in kindergarten, so that we can get students before they hit that obstacle? But then we spend the rest of our time talking about diagnostic assessments. We know that even a great screener, whether it is DIBELS or Easy CBM or STAR, whatever it is, after 1st grade, doesn't tell you anything except for oral reading fluency. And oral reading fluency is the outcome of strong phonological awareness and strong sound symbol knowledge. And our teachers after K1 need to have the ability to look and see, is there a deficit in either of those 2 areas? Because if I'm working on fluency, it's a cart before the horse model. We have to go back and work on those foundational skills. And the only way to do that is to know how to administer, interpret, and convert those scores and data into action. So that was a very long answer to your question. Yes, and yes. Assessment drives instruction. But I know, and I share this from my time, when I was teaching, DIBELS came out. And DIBELS is, widely used. It's out of University of Oregon. And it was handed to me and I was just told, do this. And I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was told, just do this for a minute. And that, unfortunately, is so much of what happens because of time and so much, lack of time for PD. I really make sure, and we spend so much time understanding what we're evaluating when we ask a 1st grader to read a list of nonsense words. What we see when we administer, let's say, a DRA, and we ask students to read the text versus when we ask them just to read a list of words. And so assessment is probably the one area that when I look at evaluations of prior participants, they give the most learning happened in that module.
Okay, and one other question. I have a grandson who's dyslexic. He's been officially labeled, if you will, or officially given that outcome.
Yes.
So with this law, we're not really necessarily saying kids are dyslexic, right? We're not screening them, if you will, or testing them, because there's a lot more to it. When I
Yes.
read his report from the psychologist,
Yes.
there's a lot of things in there. And I know that when we read it, because we put him on a 504, and of course I'm Papa, so I'm devastated, right? In reading what the psychologists are saying, that he won't be able to read beyond a 4th grade level and all these things. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, we need to learn about dyslexia, right? So that my teachers can identify kids that are like him. But I know it's more than just his reading. It ties into his writing.
Oh yeah, because it's about language processing. First of all, I want you to know Don't put a ceiling on a kid. 99% of kids can become skilled readers. They need not only the right intervention, but it's also the intensity. And we know that in a public setting, the one thing that we can't negotiate is time. So while the first piece is, let's make sure that what we're teaching and how we're teaching it is the way that the brain needs to learn, again, regardless of a diagnosis or identification of anything, all kids need to learn this way. But for your grandson and for other kids who show the warning signs or the characteristics of dyslexia, they need an intensity that is often more than we can provide in a public setting. That's the reality of it. Now, let me address your question about diagnosing. Schools don't diagnose. They just don't. But what schools do is they identify the warning signs of later reading failure, or they can identify that there is a cluster of characteristics that is consistent with the research-based definition of dyslexia. But we do not diagnose. And that is hands down, coming into the trainings, the number one question: who diagnoses? And I put a big chart up. This is what a neuropsych does. This is what an educational psychologist does. This is what a school psych does. This is what a classroom teacher, title, any school employee does. And it's very, very black and white. But man, that is such a source of confusion, because we also need to then answer the question of when a school notifies parents that we've screened your child, they have the warning signs of dyslexia. If I was that parent, the number one question I'm going to come back and say, so what are you going to do? Right? And that's where we need to be equipped to say, well, we are having a tier 2 intervention that looks like this. You know, we're going to provide the instruction. And if you want to go get a diagnosis, it may not change. It's not going to change the outcome of what we're doing here at school necessarily, but these are your options, right? SPED, outside, so on and so forth. It's a
Perfect.
big area of clarification.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Linda from Flagstaff. We just have a quick question, Nancy and I, she's on the call too. You mentioned like having everything in that Learn world, which is fabulous. So Nancy is our literacy specialist in the district kind of person.
Great.
So would she be able to do like the full training once she goes to your training? Would she be able to provide the full training in the future? And would teachers get that certificate that the state would acknowledge, or would we need to go back through you?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, again, my end goal is disseminate information. So Nancy, I can see you. You would be able to take anything you want, turn around and start offering PD. If we want to talk about PDUs, or not even PDUs, but like graduate credit, then we should probably have a side conversation, because anything's possible. But obviously, if I'm going to say this training met my standard of requirement, then we need to make sure there's some level of you know, checking in there. But in terms of equipping you with all the PowerPoints and all that, yeah, no problem.
And it would be recognized by the state. So like when we put it in our move on
No.
reading plans?
No,
No.
that's the good differentiating question. No.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So Barbara, I have another question then. So where are you located? Like if we were to hire you to do an in-service, or, you know, the training, if you will, for an entire staff in a district?
So I'm located in Portland, Oregon. And what I did out the gate was I put 5 trainings out there that are just open trainings. 3 are virtual, 2 are live. And those, you know, there are lots of districts that don't have enough schools to warrant a district specific training. So if you have, you know, a critical mass and want to do a training just for your district, happy to talk with you. And post 2016, when I trained all of Oregon, that's what I've been doing ever since, is I just now train whole districts. either grade level bands so that, and it's not a 6-day training, but it's enough that they all get the same messaging. So we can sidebar about that.
Okay, thank you.
Barbara, I have a question. I'm Lindsay from Bisbee Unified School District in Arizona. So could you give me a little bit more of a breakdown of the training offered specifically? I feel like I've looked over it and I'm maybe having a little bit, I'm just wanting to make sure, I know I have specifically a teacher in mind that I want to get trained, but I'm hoping that I can at least get somebody from each grade band trained. And so I kind of just trying to navigate that and what that looks like. And then of course, timeline on the amount of training offered.
Sure. So the comprehensive training has 3 sections: understanding, recognizing dyslexia, foundational skills instruction, and then intensifying instruction. And the full training takes 6 days. And of course, having learned from the past, doing all 6 days consecutively makes a teacher's mind go absolutely numb. So the live trainings and then the one that's happening at the end of June 2022 are Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, break for the weekend, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And that's simply because of the logistics of me traveling, other people traveling. Even though the training is divided into 3 distinct sections, just like with teaching reading, where there's 5 very big areas in reading instruction, everything is connected. So when you're talking about, phonological awareness, you're referring back to what you learned in understanding and recognizing dyslexia, because a deficit in phonological awareness is the hallmark of dyslexia. And when you're talking about intensifying instruction and helping students tune into mouth placement, right, which of course is an obstacle this year with masks, intensifying instruction for phonological awareness, you're building on what you already learned in the foundational block. So I really, encourage districts to think about doing a comprehensive training instead of piecemealing it together, simply because, like all things, if you're delivered all of the information in one, concise package, it's going to be probably more beneficial for educators and kids. And Lindsay, I'm not sure if you are wanting to know like the specific dates. I could send that to you, or if there was a follow-up to that question that I just missed.
No, that's okay. I think that you've sent out, I've gotten many of the emails, and I believe in there I was able to see the virtual versus in person and things like that. My next question is, do you spend time talking about phonics curriculums or different things that you feel are very beneficial? We in the past have struggled tremendously with phonics, and I feel like that's where we're missing our, I know that that's where we're missing our mark when it comes to good reading instruction. We see regularly that when we go, try to get kids to do their comprehension, or to read it fluently and then follow up with comprehension questions, it's just not happening. But that's because they're stumbling so much on just the actual reading, right?
The word level, yep.
Right. And so we this year did bring in a core phonics program that I'm super excited that we had the option to do, or we had that we were able to do it. But I was curious if you do focus on the different types of phonics programs that you feel are strong.
Great question. So is the core phonics program that you brought in from Core Phonics? Awesome. Okay, so let me answer your question. And I'm going to go back actually to my slide that I skipped right over, which is my training philosophy that ties right into this. And the training philosophy that kind of penetrates everything I do is there's a body of knowledge that transcends curriculum, it transcends geography and socioeconomic status. And when you have that knowledge, you can pick up and teach with sticky notes and index cards. Because at the end of the day, a curriculum doesn't teach a child, a trained teacher does. That being said, we know we need curriculum. We need curriculum for consistency. We need curriculum because we don't want our teachers having to, print everything off Teachers Pay Teachers every day. But curriculum cannot be the driving force in the way that we teach. So when it comes to answering that question, because everybody wants to know what curriculum, the tool chart that I send them to is the one from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. They have a database decision-making chart. They have their curriculum chart, and it's there that you can evaluate the efficacy of different curriculum. Now, when you say phonics, there's lots of different types of phonics. There's embedded phonics, right? And the phonics that is research-based, that is evidence-based, is systematic and explicit. And so that method of teaching is a huge part of the intro to teach. Whoops. I couldn't hear what you said. My Apple Watch. A huge part of the introduction of what does it mean to teach systematically and explicitly, where nothing is left to infer or intuit. And once you have an understanding of what that looks like, then you can start to look and say, does this curriculum teach in that way? And part of that conversation and part of that module on what is structured literacy really looks at how balanced literacy curriculum teach phonics and how that differs from structured literacy. Now, I know that, you know, districts aren't going to come in and just throw out the curriculum that's in place. And so how do we supplement what's happening in their balanced literacy, where phonics is taught according to the patterns that show up in the mentor text, versus how do students, especially the ones who are showing up in the red, need to be taught? How you reconcile those, that's always the challenge. But that's really the approach. And I know because I'm in the weeds with the teachers.
Right. So this is my second year as a principal, and I taught for 8 years prior. And so what I saw myself as a classroom teacher and teaching reading, I've taught first through fourth grade, and I realized, wow, I didn't learn, or maybe I don't remember learning to read the way I need to teach to read. And so that was the first thing that I got thinking this year. And then we were using, just like you said, with our ELA curriculum, it was embedded. And after actually looking deeper in it, it's clear. I mean, it's not enough. And so we were able to carve out time in our schedule that's devoted specifically to phonics instruction. So I'm super excited about that. But what I am noticing with the phonics instruction that we got, although it's wonderful and it's all there, the teachers still are learning to teach it while using it, which then goes back to, of course, the science of reading.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're kind of in the holdup spot is, yeah, we have this really great curriculum and it's fantastic. We have something finally. Kids know how to, the mouth formation and all, we're learning all that, but goes back to the teacher part. And so that's where we're like, that's our next big step.
Yep. Well, let me just tell you, you're headed in the right direction. You identified the issue. You've, like you said, found one piece, which is right. You have a curriculum that's aligned to the methodology that you know is going to work. And now you're building the airplane as you're flying it, because we just didn't learn this. We didn't learn it. And so I always say, you're not going to learn every single rule to be able to teach in a 6-day training. It's impossible. It's why, you know, big like Orton Gillingham used to be the umbrella of all of this knowledge. They're not 1-week trainings. They're months and months and cost thousands and thousands of dollars. But here's the thing. We have at our disposal now. If we know what we need to learn, that information is out there in video form, on demand, often for free. But you have to know what you need to learn to be able to solve the problem. And that's the first step. So for example, I teach the 5 most common spelling rules. Is that every rule? Nope. But now if you are like, why is that word spelled that way? I can tell you where to go to find the answer. But if before your only answer was, I don't know, it's just spelled that way, right? That's not helpful to kids.
Barbara, I have a question along those. Would you repeat? So you called it the national, what is this?
Yeah, the National Center on Intensive Intervention. I know my director of operations on this Zoom, maybe she can pull up the site and put it in the chat. And it's it's a database decision-making chart that includes curriculum. There's a behavior chart there. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource.
Thank you.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the resource sheets that I share, because I create a resource list for every module, I have a resource sheet for admin and I have a resources for parents and caregivers. Oh, there's a question. Oh, thank you. There's the general site. Mandy put it in. It's just intensiveintervention.org, but then you can find it. Jennifer asked, what are the responsibilities of the designee? Okay, quite simply, to attend the training. That is the responsibility. Now, I always say when trainings happen, you know, I hope that you volunteered to be here and you weren't just told, because the people who I would love to have in the seats at training are the ones who are really, really eager to learn and then can be that conduit back to their staff. But if we're talking the legal boundaries of, you know, what they're required to do, basically just attend training. And they have to complete work. I mean, they have to show that they've learned. So there's embedded assessments for knowledge. Other questions? All right. I want to just give you an update that the in-person sessions, of course, I have every hope they will occur in person. I think we've all become accustomed to just accepting that there are things beyond our control. But the standard of excellence of my trainings is the same in a virtual platform. I am well aware, as our teachers all learned, that you can't just teach as you would in person on a computer. And so I also utilize an interactive platform that's like a whiteboard, the smart boards that many teachers have in their classrooms, but it's a virtual one. And we engage on that. We obviously utilize breakout rooms, but breakout rooms is kind of everybody does that. So it's a very, very engaging training, even when done virtually. If staff that are from the same district all want to be in the same room, that's a wonderful kind of hybrid model. And I think the terms on the ODE, Arizona Department of Education sheet, live synchronous means that I'm live all day, every day. There is nothing on demand. And that's because I love the Q&A. That's where the best learning happens. And the feedback that I received after having to pivot and go virtual this year, last year, whatever year, was that teachers felt that they could ask questions and they didn't feel as vulnerable. And that's a really wonderful outcome of a situation that was obviously out of our control. So,
Barbara, real quick about the virtual trainings, is it set up the same way where you're doing 3 days, you take a break, and then 3 more days?
One of them is 3 days, 3 days. 2 of them are 3 days, 3 days, okay, but separated by a month. Oh, and okay, then another one is 2, 2, and 2. Okay. Because the live ones, because I'm traveling, I need to do it, you know, back to back. But to have time, because I'm going to say, here are follow-up articles, videos, right? Assignments. I want you to have time to digest this. And then we come back. And even though in that format, we have to go backwards a little bit before we can go forwards, it's nice to have that time to let the information sink in, to practice, and to come back fresh. Well, listen, if you have any additional questions, I am happy to talk with you on the phone, via Zoom, and bear down, everybody. And I look forward, you know, to coming to Arizona in February, because I picked the crappiest month in Oregon to come to Arizona. So wishing you all a wonderful, wonderful year of hopefully in-person learning. And I hope to see some of your educators in training, and let me know if there's anything I can do otherwise. Take care.